This is Pick Up the Mic podcast on WWMVLP 95.5 and Radio 22. This is Pick Up the Mic podcast. I'll be your host, Corey Whitmore. This podcast aims to bring new voices into the conversation about how to eliminate racial disparities in education in the Madison Metropolitan School District. Over the past couple of months, we've had numerous interviews with African-American high school juniors and seniors, principals, teachers, mental health therapists to give us more perspective on how we start this conversation and how we find potential solutions. This is episode 7, and we are going to start something I like to call fresh perspectives. And these are longer interviews that I had specifically with our community leaders. And we were able to get a great cross section of community leaders to interview from now superintendent to principals, school board members, teachers, substitute teachers, and mental health specialist. You have heard bits and pieces from them throughout the first 6 episodes, but I wanted to dive in deeper into these conversations. And I do believe that there's issues that came up in these conversations that didn't necessarily, fit nicely into, our first 6 subjects. As we got into it, I do think there's some perspectives in there that may fall outside the line of how those first 6 episodes were titled, but are very important to the conversation. So that's what we're going to do with our next 6 episodes, is really dive into those conversations. The reason I brought on different community members was to try and give some of our discussions and things that were brought up by the kids, to give it a little bit of framing, to say, hey, this could work, this couldn't work, this is why that may work, and give us a little more background, a little bit of history, and us to be able to take advantage of their experience, the things that they've seen and the things that has happened around them. So, I think to even round out this conversation more, it's important that we hear from them as well. So for today's episode, we are going to run the interview that we had with Dr. Rainey Briggs, now Superintendent Dr. Rainey Briggs. Congrats to him in the Baraboo school system. So he wrote a great dissertation at Edgewood College that we are able to review and read before we launch this podcast that I will let you guys know about. The title of it is called African American Males' Perspective on Factors That Promote or Impede Academic Success in a Predominantly White High School. And you'll hear that come up again in the interview. But it is an incredible dissertation, very insightful, packed with information and research, and we really enjoyed reading it. We learned a lot, so I would definitely want to put that out to you for anybody that may have some extra time to make. As we always do, we encourage you to do research. Hopefully we're inspiring you to go outside what you hear here on this podcast and check out articles and TED Talks and dissertations and things like this that come up. So let's go ahead and jump into our first Fresh Perspectives interview with Dr. Rainey Briggs.
Well, I'm Dr. Rainey Briggs. I grew up here in the Madison area. I've been around Madison for a very, very long time. Grew up on the south side of Madison, so over in the hood a little bit. And it's really interesting that I grew up in the hood, but went to Edgewood every single day, and being one of, at the time, 4 black males in that school was definitely an eye-opener. But I think one of the best things that's ever happened to me as I learned and adjusted a lot to who I needed to be and who I have become. So Edgewood, big ups. Thanks for being there and supporting me through all the things that I've had to go through, but it was definitely a great journey. I currently serve as the Director of Elementary Education in the Middleton Cross Plains Area School District. I've been in that role for the last 5 years, and prior to that, I was in Sun Prairie as an elementary principal, as a physical education and health teacher, and as an assistant principal at the high school. So I served 12 years in the Sun Prairie Area School District. Also worked in the Madison School District for 2 years as a head principal of an elementary school. And now, man, I'm just, like I said, enjoying life in the Middleton Cross Plains Area School District in hopes to one day become a school district superintendent. So I'm working on that right now. Worked really hard to obtain my doctorate back in 2018. And like I said, the title of it, I want to say that to you again, because I recommend that you definitely Google it, or you can email me and we can talk about getting you a copy of it. But it's African-American Males' Perspectives on Factors that Promote or Impede Academic Success in a Predominantly White High School. And like I said, you can reach out to me. I currently also own my own LLC business, and it's called Meraki Consulting. And that's Meraki, Meraki Consulting. Can be reached at rjb@somethingwithsoul.com. Anytime, you're looking for some services, we offer a number of services, from coaching to mentoring to, oh my gosh, man, Equity Institutes, inspirational speaking, man, so much. There's so much that we offer. So feel free to reach out if I can be of service to you. And that's what I got, man.
Let's start here. So the quote unquote term that you keep hearing, especially when I look back in the papers, is quote unquote achievement gap.
Yeah.
As I've gotten in these conversations, some people call it different things.
Yep.
Some people term it different. I had a conversation 2 days ago, and the gentleman I was talking to made me feel like that was a lazy term because it doesn't quite get to the heart of what's going on. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, what do you know about the achievement gap since you've been here, in the area, not specifically just Madison, and what does that mean to you when you hear that term?
Oh my goodness, my brother. I would, whoever that was that talked to you or made you feel like it's such a lazy term, it's what across the country is used to define the gaps that exist between our students of color, particularly our Black students,
right,
and white students. And it's that comparison that's always to white kids. Right. But what I would say more than anything, man, as opposed to the achievement gap, is I would lean a little bit more into the belief gap. Right. If people believed that kids can, if they believed in kids' ability, if they believed in kids' capabilities, I almost wonder, would there be such a thing as an achievement gap? Like when somebody believes that you can do something, they show it to you. You as a student feel like, yep, this particular person, teacher, family friend, mom, dad, whoever, they truly believe in me and know that I can do something that I sometimes don't believe in myself can do. And that's where that belief gap, to me, more than achievement gap comes in, because I think the belief gap contributes to the achievement gap. Right? If you believe that you can achieve, remember that statement out there, if you believe it, you can achieve it.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yep.
And if you go back to the years when that statement first came out, I don't know when it first came, but if you think about it, if you believe it, you can achieve it.
Right.
And when you look at, if you believe in this particular group of students, they will show you the achievement. You will believe in them enough to support them through those different achievements that we hope to see. We believe can happen for our kids of color. But if we don't believe in the kids, we won't see a change in the achievement gap. Bottom line, we won't see a change in it. And that achievement gap has existed for years. Man, we can go all the way back to slavery. We can go all the way back to the point in which it was illegal to read and write.
Right.
And the only group of people that suffered from that were Black people. Right? We got lynched, we got whipped, we got, punished for knowing how to read. Right? And if you think about reading back then, and then the different generations that kind of went through that, not being allowed to read or against the law to read, then you think generation upon generation, these folks could not read to their kids.
Right.
So now just think about where we are today. If you had those starting generations not being able to read, and then they started having kids, then they couldn't read. Then they started having kids. They weren't allowed to read. They started having kids and they didn't care to read.
Right.
It wasn't important because they didn't know much about it. But then we started to see it in our educational system. We started to see it cause for incarceration to arise because people didn't have the skills and the abilities to afford themselves the opportunity to not be caught in situations that warranted them to go to jail or to prison.
Right.
So that prison, that school to prison pipeline. Right, it's real, bro. It's real. And I think that's where when I hear the achievement gap, I would almost agree with whoever you spoke with. That the achievement gap is really lazy. It's a lazy term to be used to express and to identify who we are as people of color. So that's where I would lean more into the belief gap. If you believe in me, you're bound to see something more out of me. So.
Let me move to something that may be fueling, I guess, this quote unquote achievement gap: testing. So, my research, at least the last scores that were kind of politicized were the 2018, 2019, I believe, forward exam.
Yeah.
That was talking about, oh man, we have white students at this particular level when it comes to math and English. And then we have, Black students at this particular level. And I know that, from my recent conversations, it's now a new test. It's now a new test. It's not called the forward exam. They've done away with that. And it's a new test, but it's very similar. It's basically measuring a lot of the same things. My question to you, and you've alluded to this a little bit, are you surprised at the gap between white students and Black students? And do you feel that, these tests, are biased?
That's love the question, brother. Love the question. So there's two things. It is still considered the forward exam.
Okay.
That they take. But if you go back over the last, I'll say 8 to 9 years, there's been the Smarter Balance test. There's been the forward exam. There's been the WKCE. So you've had all these different exams for state testing.
All right.
And my brother, Corey, there's been no differences in those assessments, meaning the data has shown the exact same thing.
Right.
So you asked the question, does any of this surprise me?
Right.
I'm gonna get to that answer in a second, but I wanna point this out. Right now, we just went through, and we're still in the midst of a pandemic, right? And this pandemic has caused people to do things that they would have never thought they needed to do, or to change the way that they live, or to operate differently, or to think differently, or to provide differently.
Right.
Well, I'm getting ready to say something, man, that I said in the moment that this COVID came about and we deemed it a crisis. Racism is a crisis, right? And that's been
100%.
around, and that's been around for how many years, right? I'm going to say it's probably been around since the beginning of time.
Right.
And when I see how people shifted, I saw how people changed. I saw how people did things different. They put their resources into different places. They provided food and personal hygiene items to families. But yet and still, we've had the Smarter Balance, we had the WKCE, we had the Forward exam that have produced the exact same results. That's, the gap in achievement that you just asked me about, and you asked, do I believe, or do I think that this is what it's supposed to be?
Right.
No, it's not what it's supposed to be, for the same and very reasons that we shifted with COVID. But the issue is, my brother, is that COVID impacted who more? Because it changed their lifestyle. It impacted white people more because it changed their lifestyle. They no longer had, could go and do and be who they needed to be, because the state kind of put in these different orders to keep us from going places, keep us from doing things. Right. Now, the equivalent to that, to COVID and the stay-at-home order or the safe-at-home order, is the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws for us as Black people, bro, we couldn't go into certain places. We had to go around to the back door. We had to drink from certain water fountains. We had to use certain restrooms. We had to sit in certain parts of the balcony and in theaters. Like, those things in our culture and our race, we've already been exposed to.
Right.
History tells us that we know how to navigate and maneuver around these things and within these things. But in this particular case, COVID has caused our white peers and colleagues to feel like something just was taken from them, right? And there's a quote that I'm getting ready to say, and it's by Dr. Darnisha Armonti Jackson. She says, people don't fear change, they fear loss. Right? And you think about all the things that were lost because of COVID. I can go down the line. Childcare. People wanted to still go to work, but then they wanted to send their kids to schools, but school was closed, so you couldn't. So people were mad at the schooling system because they couldn't get their kids in school. But with that, people felt the loss of their kids not performing where they wanted them to perform. We have kindergarten families who want their kids to go to Yale and Harvard. And we're talking kindergarten, man. These kids, they don't even know how to wash their hands yet. But we have families that's fighting for their kids to get into Yale from kindergarten. So there's this sense of loss. My kid can't go to school and continue to learn how to read. My kid can't go to school and know how to do math. Right. And that contributes to what you asked me about in the state testing.
Right.
State testing is, we want to know how well these kids are performing in each of these districts to see how we can rate each district, whether they are exceeding expectations, whether they are just meeting expectations, or they're below expectations, and on and on. So when I think about the Forward exam, which is the one that we take now, I do not want to sit here and tell you that it's useless. Do I think it's biased? Absolutely. I think every assessment, no matter what it is, it's biased, because every assessment that we take is built for white people. Right? I can't, the only assessment years ago that was created, and I'm losing track of the name of this, it was the Black, I think it was the Black Association test, or I think it was the Black Association test, where it was a test really testing your Black understanding of things, like your Black IQ, basically. Right. And that was a test done years ago. And if you were to give white people that test right now, they right. So we're taking these tests every day that's not culturally relevant to who we are as Black and brown students. So yes, there are many biases in these tests because these tests aren't built knowing who we are, what we've been exposed to, the differing way we use words, say words, possibly even define words. So there are biases within these assessments, because what these assessments are saying is that there's only one way in America to live and to understand the English language, and that's by way of what was created by white people. And that's not a knock on white people or anything like that. It's just that it's not allowing us to have our own cultural understanding in what we do.
Thank you, Dr. Rainey Briggs. We touched on really, this mirrors our first two episodes, and we talked about the achievement gap. What is it, and talked about standardized testing / the forward exam. But the thing that sticks out to me, especially in this first part of that conversation, is the emphasis on belief, and how he feels that the foundation of a true belief in these kids can help to close, if not eliminate, the achievement gap. And belief, is interconnected with a lot of things that we've talked about in the first 6 episodes. That belief is interconnected to the aspects of the learning environment, and which some of the students spoke to teachers not pushing them, teachers not really creating relationships with some of the Black students to help them better excel and feel a part of the class. It alludes to what we talked about with the need for Black teachers and why that is so important. Because many of the students felt that Black teachers would hold them accountable, would push them harder. For students that needed help, they would feel more comfortable going to teachers that looked like them and had some sort of understanding from where they came. We talked about community. What is community's role? And community also has to share that belief and also be willing to push and get involved in the system. Show up at school board meetings, making sure they know what's going on in the school, offering services to the school, whether you're a nonprofit or business, and you can come in and you can speak and provide opportunities because you believe in these kids and what they have the ability to achieve. So it's interesting in the first part of our conversation around achievement gap that it is already interlinking things that came up from our interviews with the students, and really interlinking and should make us look harder and examine learning environment, need for Black teachers, community role. If those things can come together, and that's a belief that is being pushed at all these angles, you have a hard time believing that, and I keep using believing, I need another word, but you do have a hard time believing that maybe that could have a significant impact, bringing those aspects into it and everyone being on the same page. Getting a lot of groups on the same page, of course, is difficult. It's difficult in anything you do. But the effort still, that doesn't dismiss that the effort, doesn't need to be made, because the effort does need to be made, and systems need to be put in place in order for us to galvanize all these things to start working in a positive way and having a positive effect. So we're going to take a quick break right here. I know we've been holding your ear for a while so far, but there's just a lot in there that I wanted to get into. On the other side of this break, we are going to start talking about learning environment from his perspectives and also the need for Black teachers and Black administrators. So yeah, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this. You are tuned in to Pick Up the Mic podcast. I'm your host, Corey Whitmore. This is episode 7, Fresh Perspectives. We are diving into the interview with Dr. Rainey Briggs. We had just touched on some things about the achievement opportunity gap, standardized testing, forward exam. Let's go ahead and jump into the aspect where we are talking about the learning environment and the need for Black teachers and Black administrators. So I want to move to environment.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about the, quote unquote, what's been publicized as an achievement gap.
Mm-hmm. What
papers have alluded to almost as far back as I can go and start looking at these articles of, oh man, here's the graduation rate. Here's the percentage and gaps, things of that sort. But to solve anything, in most cases, it's multifaceted.
Yeah,
it's not just one thing. It's a number of things you have to look at. And with the kids, I really wanted to get into the learning environment. As a Black student, what is your environment like? Is it what's the experience? What is it comfortable? What are the things that are occurring that other people may not know about? And one thing consistently rose to the top. And that was, I don't have any teachers that look like me, or I have very few. And what ends up happening in many instances, as I'm sure you already know, is that, they aren't building tight relationships or even a trusting relationship between a student and a teacher. They don't feel comfortable to talk about certain things going on at home because they feel that, the teacher may not understand, or in cases of, as I've been heard, care to know what's going on at home. So, as most questions, I have a 2-part question.
Yeah.
First, how do we go about getting more teachers, administrators, counselors, faculty, period, Black faculty into some of these schools? Second question, which are really very interested in your answer to this, just because of how we crossed paths, especially when I came back to the area. A person I interviewed talked about maybe the first question before how do we get more Black faculty is, are we able to support them? Have we actually created a environment in which, if we do find the faculty, that we actually can keep them and retain them? She was far more concerned about retention than recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
So, if your take on those two things.
Yeah. So I love this question because I'm currently a part of something called the Dane County Equity Consortium that I facilitate. And this is made up of a number of Dane County school districts in the area. And I'm a part of a smaller group that's focusing on staff retention, staff recruitment. And currently in the district that I'm in, we're also going through a process of really understanding how do we keep staff of color and how do we recruit staff of color. And I'm going to tell you, like I've always said to people before we even get into how do we retain and how do we recruit, we have to educate. And when I say we have to educate, I mean we have to educate all of our white educators to help them understand why we need staff of color in these schools.
Mm-hmm.
right? There's nothing worse. And I've been there because in many districts that I've been in, I've been one of the only Black leaders or educators. I've been in schools where I was the only Black educator in the school,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if I could give you $100 or a quarter or dime, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
for the number of times that I've heard that so-and-so got the job because they're Black. Oh, so-and-so got the job because they're Hispanic, right? I think that's one of the most offensive things you can almost say to someone who is Black and brown and qualified on so many levels
Mm-hmm.
to do the very job that anyone that's white is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think number one, we have to educate our white educators around why it's important to have staff of color. There's a study that's out there that shows that the more students of color that have, or any student, not just students of color,
Right.
but students who have staff in the classroom that are Black or brown have a higher chance of graduating. So if you have one teacher, you have a higher chance.
Right.
If you have two teachers, you have an even higher chance of graduating. So think about that. Like, wouldn't we all want to make sure, and I could be totally wrong, but I've seen this in many districts that I've done work in too.
Right.
I've seen where everybody has a goal, and that goal is to increase graduation rates.
Correct.
And if we know right now that graduation rates they rise when students have had 1, 2, 3, 4 or more staff of color, why wouldn't we be educating our staff on why it's important? That's a huge goal,
right,
that districts have. There's nothing worse than having kids not graduate, go all the way through 4 years and not graduate from high school. Like, it's sad, right? So I would say, number one, we have to educate our white staff on why it's important to have staff of color. And I would say, what do we need to do to get more? Number one, educate those that are going to be working with them. But there's this diversity, belonging, and inclusion, to me, which equals equity.
Okay.
Right? Diversity means who's at the table.
Right.
Right? Who's at the table? What are they allowed to do at that table? Right? Are we bringing the voices to the table that have not usually been at the table, or the most marginalized, families or educators that haven't had the opportunity to be at the table? Are we creating a sense of belonging for them? Are we having them feel like they belong here so that they can bring their voices to the table? Right? Diversity is we're having a potluck. Belonging is that you're bringing a dish to the table, and now you're explaining why that dish is so important to you. Right? And inclusion is making sure that we're sharing the dish and people are tasting, so to speak, your culture.
Right.
And understanding the importance of that, which kind of leads to equity. When we talk about how are we going to get more people at this table, we got to look at what our schools are producing, meaning our universities, our colleges. Is the education programs thriving? Are they having Black and brown students go into education, which many of them still are? Right? It's sad. Some of them don't want to do it, but you also got to remember this, is that as students go into education, they're not going into education to be paid the way that, some of these athletes are being paid.
Right.
When we should be getting paid. Number one, pay is a huge part of why we're seeing a lack of educators in education. Number three, are we forming a program? Are we forming programs within the schools to have students come out of high school and wanting to go into education? Right? Many districts are forming these grow your own programs where you have to pay, where you the schooling, the district will pay for you to go to college or a portion of it, but then you have to come back and you owe them like 3 years of teaching before you can decide maybe to go somewhere else or whatever. But then if you don't come back and teach for them and they help you pay for your education, then you have to pay all that money back. So for students who are leaving high school that we have recruited to go into education, a part of me is we're trying to diversify just education, period. It doesn't make a difference where it is. And I think until we get on the same wavelength to say that we want to make sure that we are racially diversifying our workforce. And if there's a kid from my high school going off to University of Wisconsin, and that kid decides to go and we've supported that kid with paying tuition, and that kid decides to go into to get a job in Delaware or wherever, great. We've just increased the racial diversity of the workforce.
Right. Man, I appreciate you breaking it down like that. Man, there's a lot in there. Yeah. There's two things that really stick out to me. And it's, the first thing that sticks out, going back to the process of saying, hey, if you come back to work for us for 3 years, we'll go ahead and we'll take care of, that debt or those loans. What is a teacher to do, or how do they maintain motivation if you're coming to a toxic environment, basically only to relieve the debt off of your back, knowing that's a toxic environment? I mean, I can't imagine, being in that position, knowing that I would have to go and spend time 3 years in an environment that could be possibly destructive, just so I wouldn't have to pay that money, personally pay that money off. So I would hope that, teachers wouldn't find themselves in that predicament. Yeah. The second thing that sticks out to me is how you've, changed the perspective of how a district can recruit and how it can also make other districts, I know, for a better term, competitive in their recruitment by taking this, as I see it, kind of an inward out of, hey, we're all going to say, we're all going to learn how important this is. We're going to make it look sunnier over here instead of necessarily trying to use money or whatever means to bring somebody in, which is not going to necessarily motivate them to stay long term. It may motivate them just to be there short term, and then you're back out of a candidate of color or a Black faculty. So I mean, it makes sense, and it's like, why aren't we why aren't districts looking at it in that way? Why do you think districts aren't trying to go that route versus, a different, the routes they are taking right now?
Yeah. Corey, ever since I've been in education, and Lord knows that when I was younger, I never, ever, ever, ever wanted to go into education. I was that kid who created more challenges for educators. And I said, I didn't want to work with kids that were creating those challenges for teachers. Right. So, but my wife can trick me to volunteer in her class, man. And when I went in her class the first time, I was like, nah. Second time, I'm like, oh, this is okay. But then the third time, I asked myself that critical question: why aren't I working with kids? And when I think about that question you just asked, I've always looked at, and when this, and it dawned on me when I went to Madison and I became a principal in Madison. When I became a principal in Madison, I asked myself, why are we competing against all of these schools for the same thing? Right? We're getting kids transferring into us from Verona, from Middleton, from Prairie, and all of them are getting kids who are transferring in from us, right? So just imagine if we all work together, if we all created this, and we kind of have this Dane County Equity Consortium now that myself, along with Percy Brown Jr., facilitate, along with a couple others. But it's still this sense of competitiveness. I have to be better than the next district. I have to be better than the next group of people that's coming along, as opposed to being better together. Knowing that we're basically switching out kids. We're switching out teachers. You know what? I'm going to pay somebody more than you paying them so they can come be in my district, as opposed to looking at it as, how do we get more people to just be in education? Right. With the same goals in mind. And that's to ensure that students are being educated and that these gaps that exist are not gaps that are predictable. Right. And I think that's the issue, is that we haven't really focused on who we need to be collectively. We are a very individualistic culture. Meaning I have to be better than Corey. You know what? I can beat you one-on-one, or I can do this, or I can read faster than you. There's so many people making comparisons. And when you look at the report cards that you talked about earlier, how kids are and how districts are performing on these exams and the state testing, and then the report cards that come about that's an individualistic culture. It's not a collectivist culture. That collectivist culture brings us together. We all got the same mindset. We support one another in good times and bad times. That doesn't happen often. It's very rare. Think about it. Some Prairie just went through what they went through in the news, right? Think about the number of districts that could have been standing behind them to support in the structure of the education of people that are in that district, as opposed to everybody throwing their hands up and backing away, right? It's race. Race is really controversial, man. It's hard. People are afraid to address these things and to own it, to be vulnerable, to be humble. Those are things that nobody wants to do because it makes them appear a certain way. And it's okay to appear, a certain way. It's okay to be humble. It's okay to be vulnerable. But it's all about how you learn from those things to contribute to the greater cause.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rainey Briggs. An interesting perspective on recruitment that I have not heard really from anybody else. Really approaching recruitment more as a collective recruitment, not necessarily only this school or only this district, but collectively looking for teachers, administrators, counselors of color is an interesting way of going about it. But he is absolutely correct in people having to kind of move out of their silos and work collectively to try and make this happen, to say it's not an us versus you. And many times we are looking for how we can improve things that are right before our eyes, but not necessarily seeing the complete picture. Because he is right. We have students and administrators that'll go between schools in the same districts and things of that sort. So maybe it would be beneficial for everybody to have more of a holistic or a full picture of the impact, instead of, not just solely what do I only need from my school or my particular district. That is quite a hill to climb. But if anybody can do it, I believe Dr. Rainey Briggs can. So that is something that I hope some people can take away and give some thought to. This because, you know, it's not achievement gap or opportunity gap of one school. It doesn't say X, Y, and Z school per se has this opportunity gap or achievement gap. But it does look at Dane County. With all the schools within the Madison School District, it does say Madison, MMSD. So maybe collaborative work in this instance as well, which seems to be a theme right now. Just of things that seem to be popping up and appearing in this interview. Collaboration, holistic visions, things of that sort seem to be things that need to be re-examined and see what we can do about it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a quick break here. On the other side, Dr. Rainey Briggs will start to get into, and as we just talked about in our last episode, community role. You know, what is their role? What can they do? What can they offer to help close this achievement/opportunity gap? So let's take a break and we'll see you on the other side. You're all tuned in to Pick Up the Mic podcast with your host, Corey Whitmore. This is episode 7, Fresh Perspectives. We are talking with Dr. Rainey Briggs. Incredible interview. We've touched on a lot of topics. Right now, we are about to get into community and what is their role in helping to close this achievement/opportunity gap. Let's move into, let's still talk about environment.
Yep.
So we talked about, you know, some things with the school environment, teachers of color, specifically Black teachers. We've talked about recruitment, and kind of all the multi different things that is connected to. What I also wanted to explore, and I explored this with the students, you know, what do you believe is the community's role in helping to, you know, close this gap and to, as you put it, to help with the belief, which is coming from the students, but also to kind of help facilitate these things. You know, is there a role for the community to play? And what do you think that role is, if you think there is one for them?
Oh, the community, man. This is a really good question. And the reason that I say that this is a really good question is because it's kind of touchy for some people, right? Some people will say that like, it's the parents' responsibility. It's the parents' job to make sure their kids are acting this way or doing this or doing that or being this or being that. You know, man, I'm from this place and I always grew up with it takes a village. Right? It takes a village. It doesn't take one parent. We know that there's been families for years that have been single parented homes. There's been 2-parent homes. And I've seen single family homes do amazing things. And then I've seen 2-parent homes, just like kids are just all over the place. Right. And this is where I say it takes a village, because it's about relationships, right? My dissertation is titled African-American Males' Perspectives on Factors That Promote or Impede Academic Success in a Predominantly White High School. And one of the biggest, 2 of 3, I'll give you the top 3 things that played out. And one is staff to student relationships. 2, peer-to-peer relationships. And 3, student advocacy. And it wasn't in any order. Right. Those are the 3 things that played out hugely. And when you think about staff and student relationships, that has to be strong for there to be a sense of community role. And what I mean by that is if I have an awesome, strong relationship with kids, that means that I can connect totally different to things that are happening in the community. I can connect totally different to the families, parents, differently than I would if I didn't have a relationship with a kid.
Right.
So now the community's focus and role in all of this is that they're connected to the school. They understand what's happening. They understand, what's coming up in the school. They're communicated with well from the school to stay abreast of things. There's systems in place that they can get involved with in the schools, right? And if those things aren't communicated well, if those things aren't laid out or designed well, then you start having people feel like people aren't being transparent. People aren't allowing me to be a part of my kid's education because I'm a boisterous individual that comes into the school and let people know how I feel about certain things that didn't go so well for my kid, or how a teacher may have responded to my kid. But we only allow, for some odd reason, man, families and the community to get involved when the poop hits the fan.
Right.
Right. And at that time, it's too late. It's too late because now it's a negative focus. Right. As opposed to a positive focus. How do we positively include families and the community sooner and earlier? By making them aware of what's happening in the schools. How important education is to not only you as a parent, but how important it is to have the community involved. Right. Right. And what that may look like. What are those stipulations, so to speak? What are those ways in which the community can get involved? Or that we are originally going to lay out and maybe progressively grow to have more involvement from the community. We have to be willing to lay those things out, lay a course, out so that the community know where they can fit in at certain times or not, I think the community is always and should always be a part of what's happening in schools. There's a line that some people use in some of these districts, and you may have heard people say this, but I'm a taxpayer,
I've heard it.
I've heard it recently in my district. And when people say that to me, that's not about community. Right. Right. That's about ownership. I own you. You're going to do what I tell you to do. And that's not a good way to get the community involved either, right? So for me, it's how do we focus on community outside of having the community use lines to us that's going to put us in a tough space and place, right? So my goal when I think about the community's role is to be informative to the community, be transparent with them around how things are going, communicate with them in ways that's not belittling or having them think that they're less than. It goes back to that belief. You have to believe in your community for your community to believe in you as a school too. Right. And I think that's a huge part of that community's role and their commitment to supporting closing the gaps, because there's so much that the community can do to support. Right. Right. I mean, I remember growing up on the south side of Madison, man, and we used to have special nights in the community that was related to the school. Or we had certain nights that the churches on Sunday nights that they would have church service, bro, in the circle, in Somerset Circle. Right. Which showed how the church believed in the community. Right. It was very rare that we had the school in the community. It was always like the community had to go to the school. Right. So now we had to shift. And now we do it more often now where we actually take school to the communities where we have certain things happening at the neighborhood centers, or we have certain nights in the community. We have cookouts, things like that in the different communities. But those things are around food typically. Right. And people will say that food is a way to the community's heart. Right. It builds that camaraderie. right? It builds who we need to be together, but we can't just build it around that. We need to build it also around education.
Right.
The belief that education is the way for all kids. And I think that's the community's role, is a partnership. Mm-hmm. It's a partnership with the schools, and not you sit over there and you mind your business. When we ready for you in the schools, we'll call you in.
Right.
We should have systems and programs that's bringing the community into our schools to work with our kids, to mentor, tutor, support with many different resources based on family needs. Those are the things that we should be doing. And that's the role of the community, because anything that the community can do to support and closing the gaps, we have to allow the opportunity for that to happen.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Rainey Briggs, for taking the time to share your perspectives and your knowledge and your experience with us during this podcast. I still even have more to share with you, but that is actually going to come out in our last episode when we start talking about what we've learned over the course of these interviews and recommendations as far as moving forward. So that will not be the last of Dr. Rainey Briggs you hear. But for this episode, this is where we are going to come to a close. So like I said, I wanted to give him a special thank you. I think we're definitely going to need to do a follow-up at some point. So if you are listening and tuning in right now, I will be reaching out soon. But he brought a lot of interesting perspectives to the forefront. And for me, the themes and the things that seem to shine bright, and I hope I'm not sounding like a broken record here, really is belief in collaboration and education. Everything, almost all of these points, he said, hey, we need to educate. We need to tell the community what's going on, being transparent, ways they can be involved, ways they can help. If we're recruiting Black teachers, we need to let those teachers that are not Black to educate them why it is important. Why is it so important that we bring in Black teachers? Here's the impact. Here's what can happen. That education I see is in that forefront. Collaboration between teachers, collaborations between community, collaborations between schools and school districts when we talk about recruitment and retention. And belief. Is there a basic fundamental belief that we can close this gap? Is there belief in the students? Is there belief from the community? Is there belief reciprocated, the community into the school, but the school into the community? Is there a belief that these kids can ultimately achieve and be on a trajectory towards some sort of success? So for me, those are themes that shine very brightly, that hopefully districts, teachers, schools can take away. It almost sounds like, part of your mission statement, part of your vision board, collaboration, belief, education, which are great, but without a substantive plan, along with the wording, they're just words on a sheet of paper or words on a plaque. And without the plan and you being able to actively engage and execute that plan, that's what really gives those words value in my mind. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Episode 7, we are doing our fresh perspectives, getting in deeper with our interviews with community leaders. We will be back next week in episode 8, and I believe our interview is with former Sun Prairie School Board member Marilyn Ruffin, who's also community liaison for One City Schools in Madison. So I'm looking forward to that. So make sure you check in. Make sure to follow us on social media. Pick Up the Mic podcast. That is on Facebook and Instagram. If you put in pod.co/pickupthemic podcast, you will also find the archive of all of our past episodes if you missed them. So hopefully we'll see you guys back here next week, and enjoy your week. Until then, have a good one.